Good evening, my lovelies. Welcome back to the Tome, the channel in which every video we open up the book of wisdom and flip the page of knowledge to read about whoever or whatever we happen to land on. And today we are learning about the life and times of Samuel Pepys, the iconic English diarist and chronicler from the late Middle Ages. This is a man who lived through the Black Plague and the Great Fire of London, among other notable events. So if interesting life stories are your thing, plant a flag on that like button, hit the subscribe button, and let me know how bad I am at this in the comments section below. Okay, let's go. Samuel Pepys, born 23rd of February 1633 and died 26th of May 1703, was an English author and politician. He served as administrator of the Navy of England and was a member of Parliament, and is most famous for his diary he kept for a decade whilst still a young man. Pepys had no maritime experience, but he rose up to be the Chief Secretary of the Admiralty under both King Charles II and King James II through patronage, diligence and his talent for administration. His influence and reforms at the Admiralty were important in the early professionalism of the Royal Navy. The detailed private diary that Pepys kept from 1660 until 1669 was first published in the 19th century and is one of the most important primary sources for the English Restoration period. It provides a combination of personal revelation and eyewitness accounts of great events, such as the Great Plague of London, the Second Dutch War, and the Great Fire of London. Pepys was born in Salisbury Court, Fleet Street, London on the 23rd of February 1633. He was the son of John Pepys, a tailor, and Margaret Pepys, daughter of a Whitechapel butcher. His great-uncle Talbot Pepys was recorder and briefly a member of Parliament for Cambridge in 1625. His father's first cousin, Sir Richard Pepys, was elected MP for Sudbury in 1640, appointed Baron of the Exchequer on the 30th of May 1654, and appointed Lord Chief Justice of Ireland on the 25th of September 1655. Pepys was the fifth of 11 children, but child mortality was high and he was soon the oldest surviving child. He was baptised at St Bride's Church on the 3rd of March 1633. Pepys did not spend all of his infancy in London. For a while he was sent to live with a nurse, Goody Lawrence, at Kingsland, just north of the city. In about 1644, Pepys attended Huntingdon Grammar School before being educated at St Paul's School in London. He also notably attended the execution of King Charles I in 1649. In 1650 he went to the University of Cambridge, having received 2 exhibitions from St Paul's School, perhaps owing to the influence of Sir George Downing, who was chairman of the judges and for whom he later worked at the Exchequer, and a grant from the Mercers Company. In October he was admitted as a sizar to Magdalene College. He moved there in March 1651 and took his bachelor degree of arts in 1654. Later, in 1654 or early 1655, he entered the household of one of his father's cousins, Sir Edward Montagu, who was later dubbed the first Earl of Sandwich. Pepys married 14-year-old Elizabeth de St Michael, a descendant of French Huguenot migrants, first in a religious ceremony on the 10th of October 1655 and later in a civil ceremony on the 1st of December 1655. From a young age, Pepys suffered from bladder stones in his urinary tract, a condition from which his mother and brother John also suffered. He was almost never without pain, as well as other symptoms including blood in the urine. By the time of his marriage, the condition was very severe. In 1657, Pepys decided to undergo surgery, not an easy option, as the operation was known to be especially painful and hazardous. Nevertheless, Pepys consulted Surgeon Thomas Hollier, and on the 26th of March 1658, the operation took place in a bedroom in the house of Pepys' cousin Jane Turner. Pepys' stones was successfully removed, and he resolved to hold a celebration on every anniversary of the operation, which he did for several years. However, there was long-term effects from the operation. The incision on his bladder broke open again late in his life. The procedure may have left him sterile, though there is no direct evidence for this, as he was childless before the operation. In mid-1658, Pepys moved to Axe Yard, near the modern Downing Street. He worked as a teller in the Exchequer under George Downing. On January 1st, 1660, Pepys began to keep a diary. He recorded his daily life for almost 10 years. This record of a decade of Pepys' life is more than 1 million words long and is often regarded as Britain's most celebrated diary. Pepys has been called the greatest diarist of all time due to his frankness in writing concerning his own weaknesses and the accuracy with which he records events of daily life in Britain and major events of the 17th century. Pepys wrote about the contemporary court and theatre, including his amorous affairs with the actresses, his household, and major political and social occurrences. Historians have been using his diary to gain greater insight and understanding of life in London in the 17th century. Pepys wrote consistently on subjects such as personal finances, the time he got up in the morning, the weather, and what he ate. He wrote at length about his new watch, which he was very proud of, and which had an alarm, a new accessory for the time. A county visitor who did not enjoy his time in London because he felt like it was too crowded, and his cat waking him up at 1 in the morning. Pepys' diary is one of the very few sources which provide such length in details of everyday life of the upper middle class man during the 17th century. Aside from day-to-day activities, Pepys also commented on the significant and turbulent events of his nation. England was in disarray when he began writing his diary. Oliver Cromwell had just died a few years before, creating a period of civil unrest and a large power vacuum that needed to be filled. Pepys had been a strong supporter of Cromwell, but he converted to the royalist cause upon the Protector's death. He was on the ship that returned King Charles II to England to take up his throne, and gave first-hand accounts of the other significant events from the early days of the Restoration, such as the coronation of King Charles II, the Great Plague, the Great Fire of London, and the Anglo-Dutch Wars. Pepys did not plan on his contemporaries ever seeing his diary, which is evidenced from the fact that he wrote in shorthand and sometimes even in code. Of various Spanish, French and Italian words, especially when describing his illicit affairs. However, Pepys often juxtaposed profanities in his native English amidst his code of foreign words, a practice which would reveal the details to any casual reader. He did intend, however, for future generations to see his diary, as evidenced by its inclusion in his library and its catalogue before his death, along with the shorthand guide he used and the elaborate planning by which he ensured his library survived intact even after his death. The woman whom he pursued, his friends and his dealings are all laid out. His diary reveals his jealousies, insecurities, trivial concerns and his fractious relationship with his wife. Pepys' diary provides first-hand accounts of the Restoration, and it is also notable for its detailed accounts of the aforementioned major events of the 1660s, along with lesser-known diary of John Evelyn. In particular, it is an invaluable source for the study of the Second Anglo-Dutch War of 1665 to 1667, the Great Plague of 1665, and the Great Fire of London. In the early 1665, the start of the Second Anglo-Dutch War placed great pressure on Pepys. His colleagues were either engaged elsewhere or incompetent, and Pepys had to conduct a great deal of business for himself. He excelled under pressure, which was extreme due to the complexity and underfunding of the Royal Navy at the time. At the outset, he proposed a centralised approach to supplying the fleet. His idea was accepted and he was made Surveyor General of Victualling in October 1665. The position brought a further £300 a year, a small fortune for the time. Pepys wrote about the Second Anglo-Dutch War, quote, "In all things, in wisdom, courage, force and success, the Dutch have the best of us and do end the war with victory on their side," end quote. And King Charles II said, quote, "Don't fight the Dutch, imitate them," end quote. In 1667, with the war lost, Pepys helped to discharge the navy. The Dutch had defeated England on open water and now began to threaten English soil itself. In June 1667, they conducted their raid on the Medway, broke the defensive chain at Gillingham, and towed away the Royal Charles, one of the Royal Navy's most important ships. As he had done during the fire and the plague, Pepys again removed his wife and his gold from London. Outbreaks of plague were not particularly unusual events in London. Major epidemics had occurred in 1592, 1603, 1625 and 1636. Furthermore, Pepys was not among the group of people who were most at risk. He did not live in cramped housing, he did not routinely mix with the poor, and he was not required to keep his family in London in the event of a crisis. It was not until June 1665 that the unusual seriousness of the plague became apparent, so Pepys's activities in the first 5 months of 1665 were not significantly affected by it. Indeed, Claire Tomerlin wrote that the most notable fact about Pepys's plague year is that to him it was one of the happiest of his life, end quote. In 1665 he worked very hard and the outcome was that he quadrupled his fortune. In his annual summary on the 31st of December, he wrote, quote, "I never lived so merrily. Beside that, I never got so much, as I have done this plague time," end quote. Nevertheless, Pepys was certainly concerned about the plague. On the 16th of August, he wrote, quote, "But Lord, how sad a sight is it to see the streets empty of people, and very few upon the change, jealous of every door that one sees shut up, lest it should be the plague, and about us 2 shops in 3, if not more, generally shut up," end quote. He also chewed tobacco as a protection against infection and worried that wig makers might be using hair from the corpses as raw material. Furthermore, it was Pepys who suggested that the Navy Office should evacuate to Greenwich, although he did offer to remain in town himself. He later took great pride in his stoicism. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Pepys was sent to Woolwich. She did not return to Seething Lane until January 1666 and was shocked by the sight of St Olave's churchyard, where 300 people had just been buried. In the early hours of the 2nd of September 1666, Pepys was awakened by Jane, the maid, his servant, who had spotted a fire in the Billingsgate area of the city. He decided that the fire was not particularly serious and returned to bed. Shortly after waking, his servant returned and reported that 300 houses had been destroyed so far and that London Bridge was being threatened. Pepys went to the Tower of London to get a better view. Without returning home, he took a boat and observed the fire for over an hour. In his diary, Pepys recorded his observations as follows, quote, "I down to the waterside, and there got a boat and through bridge, and there saw a lamentable fire. Poor Michael's house, as far as the Old Swan, already burned that way, and the fire running further, that in a very little time it got as far as the steeple yard, whilst I was there, everybody endeavouring to remove their goods, and flinging into the river or bringing them into lighters that lay off. Poor people staying in their houses as long as till the very fire touched them, and then running into boats, or clambering from one pair of stairs by the waterside to another. And among other things, the poor pigeons. I receive were loth to leave their houses, but hovering above the windows and balconies till they were, some of them, burned, their wings, and fell down, having stayed, and in an hour's time seen the fire rage every way, and nobody to my sight endeavouring to quench it, but to remove their goods and leave all to the fire, and having seen it as far as the steel yard, and the wind mighty high, and driving it into the city, and everything after so long a drought proving combustible, even the very stones of churches, and among other things the poor steeple by which pretty Mrs. Smith lives, and whereof my old schoolfellow Eldborough is parson, taken the fire to the very top, and there burned till it fell down." End quote. The wind was driving the fire westward, so he ordered the boat to go to Westchapel, and became the first person to inform the king of the fire. According to his entry of the 2nd of September 1666, Pepys recommended to the king that homes be pulled down in the path of the fire in order to stem its progress. Accepting this advice, the king told him to go to Lord Mayor Tome of Bloodworth and tell him to start pulling down houses. Pepys took a coach back as far as St. Paul's Cathedral before setting off on foot through the burning city. He found the Lord Mayor, who said, "Lord, what can I do? I am spent. People will not obey me. I have been pulling down houses, but the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it." At noon he returned home and had an extraordinarily good dinner, and as merry as at the time we could be, before returning to watch the fire in the city once more. Later he returned to Whitehall, then met his wife in St. James's Park. In the evening they watched the fire from the safety of Bankside. Pepys writes that, quote, "It made me weep to see it," end quote. Returning home, Pepys met his clerk, Tom Hayter, who had lost everything. Hearing news that the fire was advancing, he started to pack his possessions by moonlight. A cart arrived at 4 a.m. on the 3rd of September, and Pepys spent much of that day arranging the removal of his possessions. Many of his valuables, including his diary, were sent to a friend from the Navy Office at Bethnal Green. At night, he fed upon the remains of yesterday's dinner, having no fire nor dishes nor any opportunity of dressing of anything. The next day, Pepys continued to arrange the removal of his possessions. By then, he believed that Seething Lane was in grave danger, so he suggested calling men from Deptford to help pull down the house and defend the king's property. He described the chaos in the city and his curious attempt at saving his own goods. Quote, "Sir W. Penn and I to Tower Street, and there met the fire burning 3 or 4 doors beyond Mr. Howell's, whose goods, poor man, his trays, dishes and shovels, were flung all along Tower Street in the kennels, and people working therein from one end to the other. The fire coming on in that narrow street, on both sides, with infinite fury. Sir W. Batten, not known how to remove his wine, dig a pit in the garden and laid it there, and I took the opportunity of laying all the papers of my office that I could not otherwise dispose of. And in the evening Sir W. Penn and I dig another, and put our wine in it, and I Parmesan cheese, as well as my wine and some other things." End quote. Pepys had taken to sleeping on his office floor. On Wednesday the 5th September he was awakened by his wife at 2 a.m. She told him that the fire had almost reached All Hallows by the Tower, and that it was at the foot of Seething Lane. He decided to send her and his gold, about £2,550 worth, to Woolwich in the following days. Pepys witnessed looting, disorder and disruption. On the 7th of September he went to St. Paul's Wharf and saw the ruins of St. Paul's Cathedral, his old school, and of his father's house, and of the house in which he had his stones removed. Despite all of this destruction, Pepys's house, office and diary were all saved. The diary gives a detailed account of Pepys's personal life. He was fond of wine, plays and the company of other people. He also spent time evaluating his fortune and his place in the world. He was always curious and often acted on the curiosity, as he acted upon almost all of his impulses. Periodically, he would resolve to devote more time to hard work instead of leisure. For example, in his entry for New Year's Eve 1661, he writes, quote, "I have taken newly a solemn oath about abstaining from plays and wine." End quote. The following months reveal his lapses to the reader. By February the 17th, it is recorded, quote, "Here I drank wine upon necessity, being ill for the want of it." End quote. Propriety did not prevent him from engaging in a number of extramarital liaisons with various women that were chronicled in his diary, often in some detail when related to intimate details. The most dramatic of these encounters was with Deborah Willett, a young woman engaged as a companion for Elizabeth Pepys. On 25th of October 1668, Pepys was surprised by his wife as he embraced Deb Willett. He writes that his wife, quote, "coming up suddenly, did find me embracing the girl, with my hand under her coat, and indeed I was with my main hand in her cunny. I was at a wonderful loss upon it, and the girl also." End quote. Following this event, he was characteristically filled with remorse, but equally characteristically continued to pursue Willett after she had been dismissed from the Pepys household. Pepys also had a habit of fondling the breasts of his maid Mary Mercer while she was dressing him in the morning. Pepys's health suffered from the long hours that he worked throughout the period of the diary. Specifically, he believed that his eyesight had been affected by his work. He reluctantly concluded in his last entry dated 31st of May 1669 that he should completely stop writing for the sake of his eyes. Pepys was imprisoned on suspicion of Jacobitism from May to July 1689 and again in June 1690, but no charges were ever successfully brought against him. After his release, he retired from public life at the age of 57. He moved out of London 10 years later, in 1701, to a house in Clapham owned by his friend William Hewer, who had begun his career working for Pepys in the Admiralty. Clapham was in the county at the time. It is now, of course, part of inner London. Pepys lived there until his death on 26th of May 1703. He had no children and bequeathed his estate to his unmarried nephew John Jackson. So that brings us to the end of the life and times of Samuel Pepys, England's best known late middle age chronicler and diarist. Thank you very much for watching the Tome. I hope you learned something today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. Thank you very much for watching. If you haven't yet subscribed to the Tome, hit that notification bell, share the video around, and let me know what you think in the comments section below. We will come back next time to learn something new. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.